On a cold January night, a billionaire CEO stumbles upon a homeless little boy and freezes in shock when he recognizes the pendant around the boy's neck. The city was a frozen labyrinth under the weight of January's icy grip. Snowflakes spiraled down, glinting under the cold, artificial glow of streetlights. Alexander Pierce adjusted his scarf, the thick cashmere doing little to buffer the biting wind as he exited the towering skyscraper that bore his name. The late hour meant the streets were quiet, save for the occasional car passing by, its tires crunching against the icy pavement. Alexander's thoughts were a haze of contracts, boardroom discussions, and an endless stream of emails. Another late night, another victory for his empire, yet as the cold settled in his bones, he felt a hollow ache, a vague, unplaceable yearning for something beyond the numbers and accolades. Just as he reached for his car key fob, a flicker of movement near the building's entrance caught his eye. It was a child, a boy, no older than 9 or 10, curled up against the side of the marble steps. The boy's knees were drawn tightly to his chest, his thin arms wrapped around them in a futile attempt to stave off the cold. His coat, oversized and tattered, looked as though it had weathered a lifetime of winters. Alexander paused, his sharp instincts telling him to keep walking. He had no time for distractions, no patience for disruptions. But something rooted him in place. There was something about the boy's stillness, the way he sat there like a forgotten shadow, that gnawed at Alexander's conscience. The boy shifted, his coat slipping slightly, revealing a glint of silver around his neck. For a moment, Alexander thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw it clearly, a small pendant swaying gently against the boy's chest. It was unmistakable. A simple design, but one etched so vividly in Alexander's memory that it felt like a punch to his gut. Decades ago, on another cold night, he had given that very pendant to Isabel Clark. It had been a token of his love, a symbol of promises they made but never kept. Seeing it now here, in the possession of this child, felt like the universe had split open and spilled its secrets. Alexander approached cautiously, his breath forming wisps in the icy air. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice soft yet firm, the practiced tone of a man accustomed to commanding attention. The boy flinched, his eyes snapping up to meet Alexander's. They were wide and wary, as if expecting trouble. His face, smudged with dirt, bore the kind of exhaustion that no child should ever wear. "I'm not going to hurt you," Alexander said, crouching slightly to meet the boy's eye level. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, his grip tightening around his knees. "Charlie," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Charlie," Alexander repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "What are you doing out here? It's freezing." Charlie shrugged, his small shoulders rising and falling as though the question didn't warrant an answer. "Nowhere else to go," he said simply. Alexander's eyes drifted back to the pendant. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his tone careful, but the intensity in his gaze betrayed his calm exterior. Charlie's hand instinctively flew to the pendant, clutching it as if to protect it from being taken. "It's my mom's," he said defensively. "She gave it to me." A knot tightened in Alexander's chest. "Your mom? Where is she?" The boy's face fell, and for a moment, Alexander regretted asking. "She's gone," Charlie said quietly, his voice breaking on the last word. He looked away, staring at the slushy street as if it might swallow him whole. Alexander's heart, long shielded by layers of ambition and detachment, cracked just enough to let the boy's words seep in. He wanted to press further, to ask about Isabel, but the sight of Charlie's trembling form stopped him. There would be time for answers later. "Come inside," Alexander said, rising to his full height. He held out a hand, but Charlie didn't move. "I'll get in trouble," the boy said warily, his eyes darting toward the towering glass doors behind Alexander. "No, you won't," Alexander assured him. "This is my building. You're safe with me." Charlie looked at him skeptically, as if weighing his options. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he reached out and took Alexander's hand. His grip was small and icy, a stark contrast to Alexander's warm, gloved one. Inside the building, The warmth was almost suffocating after the biting cold. Alexander led Charlie to a quiet corner of the lobby, motioning for a security guard to bring a blanket. As Charlie wrapped himself in the thick wool, his small frame seemed even more fragile. "Hungry?" Alexander asked. Charlie nodded hesitantly. Alexander gestured to the concierge desk, instructing them to bring up hot food to one of the guest suites. "You're staying here tonight," Alexander said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Charlie's eyes widened. "I don't have any money." "You don't need money," Alexander interrupted. "Consider it a favor." As they waited for the food, Alexander's gaze kept drifting to the pendant. The past felt unbearably close, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. He thought of Isabel, her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about their dreams. He hadn't thought about her in years, burying those memories under the weight of success. And yet, here was this boy, pulling her ghost back into the light. "Charlie," Alexander began cautiously, "do you know where your mom got that pendant?" Charlie looked at him, confused by the sudden question. "She always had it," he said simply. "She told me it was special." Alexander nodded, though the answer did little to satisfy the storm of questions brewing in his mind. There was more to this story, more than Charlie likely understood. The food arrived, breaking the tension. Charlie ate ravenously, his small hands fumbling with utensils as if he hadn't held them in days. Alexander watched in silence, a strange protectiveness washing over him. When the boy finally looked up, his cheeks flushed from the warmth and food, Alexander saw something in his eyes, an echo of Isabel's gaze. It was faint, but it was enough to stir a flicker of hope, a possibility he hadn't dared to consider. As the night stretched on, Alexander escorted Charlie to the guest suite. The boy hesitated at the door, looking back at Alexander with a mix of gratitude and fear. "Get some rest," Alexander said, his voice softer than he intended. "We'll talk more in the morning." Charlie nodded and disappeared into the room, leaving Alexander alone in the corridor. For a long moment, he stood there, staring at the closed door, his mind racing. The pendant, the boy, Isabel, it all felt too coincidental to ignore. And yet, Alexander knew that uncovering the truth would mean opening doors he had long since locked. With a heavy sigh, he turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in silence. But for Alexander Pierce, the stillness was fleeting. The questions were only just beginning. The echo of his footsteps in the corridor lingered long after Alexander had left Charlie at the guest suite. Back in his penthouse office, the city sprawled out before him, a glittering web of lights against the winter darkness. But Alexander's gaze wasn't on the view. His thoughts were consumed by the pendant, its familiar design carving a path through memories he had long buried. Isabel. Her name felt foreign on his tongue after all these years, but now it hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. He barely slept that night. The faint hope that Charlie's story might lead back to her tangled with the guilt of having let her slip away. As dawn broke over the skyline, Alexander resolved to press Charlie for more answers. There was no coincidence in the boy's appearance, not with that pendant around his neck. When Alexander returned to the guest suite later that morning, Charlie was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the plush armchair by the window. He looked small and out of place against the backdrop of luxury, the oversized blanket draped around his shoulders like a makeshift shield. A tray of untouched breakfast sat on the coffee table before him. "You didn't eat," Alexander observed, his voice softer than usual. Charlie shrugged. "It feels weird. Like I shouldn't be here." "You're not in trouble, Charlie," Alexander assured him as he sat on the sofa across from the boy. "I just want to help." For a moment, Charlie hesitated, as if weighing the truth in Alexander's words. Then, with a small nod, he picked up a piece of toast and took a cautious bite. Alexander let the silence linger, giving the boy time to feel at ease before steering the conversation where it needed to go. "Charlie," he began after a while. "About that pendant you're wearing. You said it belonged to your mom?" The boy's hand instinctively moved to the small charm at his chest. He nodded. She always wore it. Said it was special. Do you know where she got it? Alexander asked, careful to keep his tone casual despite the weight of his curiosity. Charlie furrowed his brow, his young face scrunching in thought. Not really. She said someone gave it to her when she was young. Someone she loved. His voice faltered, and he looked down, focusing on his hands. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his chest tightening at the mention of love. Your mom, what was her name? Anna, Charlie said softly. Anna Clark. The name hit Alexander like a tidal wave, though he kept his expression neutral. Isabel Clark. The connection seemed too strong to ignore. Had she changed her name? Why? And why had she ended up in such dire circumstances? Can you tell me more about her? Alexander asked gently. Charlie hesitated, his grip on the pendant tightening. She was amazing, he said, his voice cracking. She worked hard. She always said we didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. Alexander felt a pang of guilt. Isabel, or Anna, as she had become, had deserved more. Far more. And what happened to her? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Charlie's lips quivered. She got sick. We didn't have money for doctors, and she didn't want to go to the hospital. He paused, taking a shaky breath. She said it was just a cold, but it wasn't. The boy's words cut deeper than Alexander had expected. Isabel, the woman who had once lit up his world, had faced illness and death alone, unable to afford care. And now, her son, this boy who bore her strength in his every word, was sitting here, lost and adrift. I'm sorry, Charlie, Alexander said softly, the sincerity in his voice undeniable. Charlie looked up, his eyes glassy. Why are you asking so many questions about her? Alexander hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She sounds like someone I used to know, he admitted. A long time ago. The boy's brow furrowed. You knew her? I think I might have, Alexander said, choosing his words carefully. I'm not sure yet, but the pendant she gave you looks exactly like one I gave to someone very special to me. Charlie's gaze dropped back to the charm around his neck. She always said it was a gift from someone important. Someone she never forgot. Alexander's breath caught at the boy's words. Could it really be Isabel? The possibility filled him with both hope and regret. He wanted to believe it, but the implications were overwhelming. Do you remember anything else about her past? Alexander asked. Did she ever talk about where she grew up or people she knew? Charlie shook his head. Not really. She didn't like talking about before I was born. She said it was too painful. Alexander leaned back, the weight of the conversation settling over him. Isabel, or Anna, had deliberately kept her past hidden. Whatever had driven her to leave, it had clearly left scars. He needed answers, but pushing Charlie further wasn't the way to get them. The boy had already been through too much, and Alexander wasn't about to add to his burdens. I think your mom was an incredible woman, Alexander said after a moment. She must have loved you very much. Charlie nodded, his lips curving into the faintest of smiles. She did. She always said I was her greatest treasure. The warmth in the boy's voice struck a chord in Alexander. He couldn't change what had happened to Isabel, but he could make a difference now, for Charlie. I need to step out for a bit, Alexander said, rising to his feet. But you'll be safe here. If you need anything, just let the staff know. Charlie looked up at him, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. You're coming back, right? I promise, Alexander said firmly. I just have a few things to take care of. As Alexander left the suite, his mind churned with questions. If Anna Clark was truly Isabel, what had led her to this life? And why hadn't she reached out to him? Back in his office, he called his assistant, Maggie, and laid out the situation. I need you to look into someone, he said. Anna Clark. Start with public records, but dig deeper if you have to. I need everything you can find. Maggie, ever efficient, nodded without hesitation. I'll get right on it. As the call ended, Alexander stared at the cityscape beyond his window. He had spent years chasing power and success, but now, faced with the mystery of Isabel and the boy she had left behind, he felt a pull stronger than ambition. The pendant, the boy, the connection to Isabel, it all pointed to a story he had to uncover. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt that he was on the verge of something truly meaningful. The city was still under winter's icy grasp, but the morning sun filtered through Alexander's office windows, casting long, cold shadows across the room. He stood by the window, nursing a cup of black coffee, his mind far from the bustling world below. The conversation with Charlie lingered in his thoughts, particularly the way the boy spoke about his mother, Anna, no, Isabel. He couldn't shake the sense of connection, the almost certain truth that Anna and Isabel were one and the same. The pendant, Charlie's description of her strength, even the guarded pain in the boy's voice when he spoke of her past, it all fit. But the memories it stirred were bittersweet, tinged with a sense of loss that had never fully healed. Alexander had been 18 when he met Isabel Clark. She was radiant, with a laugh that could light up even the darkest of days. They had met during a summer job at the local library, bonding over shared jokes and dreams of escaping their small town. Their romance had been intense, the kind of connection that felt like it would last forever. He remembered the way she wore that pendant, the one he had saved for weeks to buy, like it was the most precious thing in the world. But forever had ended abruptly. Isabel had vanished one day, leaving behind a vague note about needing to move on, about not wanting to hold him back. He had tried to find her, tried to make sense of her disappearance, but she had left no trail. Eventually, the demands of college and ambition buried his heartbreak, though the wound never completely healed. Now, decades later, the past was colliding with his present, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear. He drained the rest of his coffee, setting the cup down with a decisive clink. He had spent years building an empire, solving problems others deemed insurmountable. This was no different. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "Maggie," he said, pressing the intercom on his desk. "Can you come in?" Moments later, Maggie appeared, a tablet in hand and her usual no-nonsense expression firmly in place. "What can I do for you, Mr. Pierce?" Alexander gestured for her to sit. "I need you to prioritize something for me. There's a boy, Charlie. He's staying in one of the guest suites. His mother was Anna Clark. I need you to dig into her background, everything you can find. She may have gone by another name in the past, Isabel Clark." Maggie arched an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. "Do you have a starting point? Any records, locations, connections?" "She passed away recently," Alexander said, his tone heavy. "She and Charlie were struggling. Start with public records, maybe hospitals or shelters. And if you need to, reach out to some private investigators." "Understood," Maggie said, already jotting down notes. "I'll keep you updated." As she left, Alexander leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had spent his life controlling every aspect of his world, but now, the uncertainty gnawed at him. He could only hope Maggie's efficiency would bring clarity. Later that afternoon, Alexander decided to check on Charlie. He found the boy sitting cross-legged on the floor of the suite, a tablet open in front of him. The screen displayed a colorful game, though Charlie didn't seem particularly invested in it. "You settling in okay?" Alexander asked, stepping into the room. Charlie glanced up, nodding hesitantly. "Yeah. It's nice here. Better than. Well, you know." Alexander sat on the edge of the sofa, watching the boy for a moment. He was still wary, still holding on to an invisible wall that Alexander couldn't quite break through. But he understood. Trust wasn't something that came easily, especially for a child who had known so little stability. "What are you playing?" Alexander asked, nodding toward the tablet. Charlie shrugged. "Some game your assistant showed me. It's okay." Alexander smiled faintly. "Maggie's good at finding things to keep people busy." There was a beat of silence before Charlie spoke again. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice cautious but curious. Alexander hesitated. He didn't want to overwhelm Charlie with the full truth, not yet. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. No one should have to go through what you've been through. And your mom, she sounds like she was an incredible person. Charlie's grip on the tablet tightened slightly, his eyes flickering with something Alexander couldn't quite place. She always took care of me, even when things got really bad. Alexander nodded, sensing the depth of the boy's love for his mother. It sounds like she did her best to make sure you were okay. That's what good parents do. Charlie's expression softened, though he still seemed unsure. You talk like you knew her. I might have, Alexander admitted. A long time ago. But I'm not sure yet. The boy tilted his head, curiosity sparking in his eyes. Did you love her? The question caught Alexander off guard, but he didn't falter. Yes, he said honestly. I did. She was very special to me. Charlie stared at him for a moment, as if weighing the truth in his words. Then he looked away, his fingers fiddling with the pendant around his neck. She never talked about anyone like that, he said quietly. She just said the pendant was from someone important. Alexander's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. Sometimes people keep their stories to themselves. Maybe she thought it was too painful to talk about. Charlie nodded, though he didn't say anything more. Alexander let the silence linger, not wanting to push too hard. Instead, he stood and ruffled the boy's hair gently, surprising even himself with the gesture. I'll let you get back to your game, he said, his tone lighter. But if you need anything, you can always come find me. Charlie nodded again, watching as Alexander left the room. Back in his office, Alexander stared at the file Maggie had begun compiling on her tablet. The pieces of Isabel's, or Anna's, life were starting to come together, but there was still so much missing. He tapped his fingers on the desk, his thoughts racing. If she had been struggling, why hadn't she reached out? What had driven her to live such a life of hardship? And why, after all these years, had their paths crossed again through Charlie? The pendant sat on his desk, a silent reminder of everything he didn't know. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let the boy be left to fend for himself. Isabel's story might have ended, but Alexander felt a responsibility to ensure Charlie's story had a better beginning. The pendant felt heavier in Alexander's hand than it had any right to be. It sat on his desk, a small and silent thing, yet it carried the weight of decades of questions, regrets, and now, responsibility. Each time he looked at it, he thought of Charlie, of Isabel, or Anna, as she had come to be known, and the life she must have lived. He had spent hours staring at it as if it could somehow answer the questions burning in his mind. The soft chime of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. Maggie's name lit up the screen. He answered quickly, his voice sharper than intended. What did you find? I think you should sit down for this, she said, her voice calm but laced with a seriousness that made Alexander's chest tighten. I'm already sitting, he replied, though he was gripping the arm of his chair now. Go on. Anna Clark was Isabel Clark, Maggie began. There's no doubt about it. She changed her name shortly after leaving your hometown. I found a few records showing she lived in different cities over the years, mostly small towns. It seems like she kept a low profile. Alexander's grip on the chair loosened slightly. Why did she leave? Did you find anything about that? Maggie hesitated. I couldn't find anything concrete about why she left, but there's more. She eventually settled in a nearby town about a decade ago. That's where Charlie was born. From what I can gather, she raised him on her own. There's no record of a partner or anyone else involved. Alexander's mind raced. He had hoped for answers, but this only brought more questions. Why had she kept her distance? Why hadn't she reached out, especially when she had Charlie to care for? Maggie continued, her tone softer now. There's something else you should know. Isabel had another pregnancy after she left your hometown, but that was long before Charlie was born. According to the records, she had a child in her early 20s, but there's no mention of what happened to that baby. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Alexander could barely process them. Another child? He asked, his voice strained. What do you mean, no mention of what happened? I mean exactly that, Maggie said gently. There's no further record of the child. It's possible the baby was adopted, or something else happened. I'll keep looking, but I thought you should know. Alexander leaned back in his chair, the weight of this new revelation settling over him. Isabel had carried so much, lived through so much, and yet he had been completely unaware. What about her passing? He asked after a long pause, his voice quieter now. What happened? Maggie exhaled softly, as if bracing herself for the blow she was about to deliver. She passed away a few months ago. Pneumonia, from what I could gather. She was already in poor health, and she didn't get the medical care she needed in time. She and Charlie had been moving between shelters for a while. The words hit him like a physical blow. Isabel, strong, vibrant Isabel, reduced to such a fate. It didn't seem possible, yet here it was, laid bare in the cold facts of a report. She had been alone, struggling, and ultimately lost, while he had been consumed by boardrooms and business deals. Alexander was silent for so long that Maggie's voice eventually broke the quiet. I'm sorry, sir. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. No, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. But it's what I needed to hear. Thank you, Maggie. After ending the call, he sat in the silence of his office, staring at the pendant again. It wasn't just a trinket anymore. It was the thread that tied him to Isabel and to Charlie, the only piece of her that remained in this world. By the time Alexander visited Charlie again that evening, his resolve had solidified. He found the boy sitting cross-legged on the carpet, flipping through a book one of the staff had brought him. Charlie looked up when Alexander entered, his face lighting up with a cautious sort of relief. Hey, Charlie said quietly. You came back. Of course I did, Alexander replied, sitting down on the edge of the couch. I promised I would, didn't I? Charlie nodded, closing the book carefully. I didn't think you'd stay interested. Most people don't. Alexander's chest tightened at the boy's words, a reminder of just how much Charlie had endured in his short life. Well, I'm not most people, he said, managing a small smile. And I want to make sure you're okay. Charlie hesitated, as if weighing whether to believe him. Did you find out anything about my mom? He asked finally, his voice tentative. Alexander took a deep breath, his mind racing for the right words. I did, he said carefully. I learned that your mom was someone very special. She went through a lot, but she always did her best for you. Charlie's eyes filled with something Alexander could only describe as longing. She always told me I was her